You ever notice how the quiet ones never look lost? The voice came from across the mess hall, sharp enough to cut through the clatter of trays and low conversation, and just loud enough to draw a few smirks from nearby tables, because at 1,200 hours the Naval Special Warfare Mess was a controlled storm of movement and noise, boots scraping against polished floors, metal utensils tapping against plastic trays, the hum of voices layered over the distant whir of ventilation. But in the far corner, tucked against a wall where the sunlight filtered in through reinforced glass, there was a pocket of stillness that didn't belong, and at the center of it sat an old man who didn't match anything around him. Arthur Brennan held his fork with a steady hand, cutting into his food with slow, deliberate movements, his back straight despite his age, his posture too precise for someone who was supposed to be out of place, his gray hair neatly combed, his jacket simple and worn. The kind of civilian coat that had seen more winters than most of the men in the room had deployments, and yet nothing about him looked careless, nothing about him looked accidental. While across the room Tyler Knox noticed him the way a hunter notices something that doesn't fit the pattern, a flicker of curiosity sharpened by boredom, because Knox was used to reading rooms fast, used to identifying threats, outliers, anything that didn't belong. And this old man sitting in a section reserved for operators set off something in his mind that wasn't quite alarm, but wasn't nothing either, so he nudged the two SEALs beside him, a half-grin forming as he tilted his head toward the corner. And just like that the mood shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for a few nearby eyes to follow their movement, enough for the air to tighten in that subtle way it does before something happens, and Knox stood, rolling his shoulders once as if shaking off the last of a long morning, his boots carrying him across the mess hall with an easy confidence that came from years of being exactly where he belonged. While Arthur Brennan didn't look up, didn't react, didn't acknowledge the approaching presence, his attention fixed on the quiet ritual of his meal, the scrape of his fork against the plate measured and unhurried. And that, more than anything, was what drew the attention, because in a room full of men who filled space with noise and motion, the one man who didn't seem to command it without trying, and Knox stopped at the edge of the table, close enough now that the scent of coffee and starch from his uniform cut through the older man's space, and for a second he just stood there, studying him, waiting for some sign of confusion, some flicker of discomfort. Anything that would confirm what he already assumed, but Brennan gave him nothing, not even a glance, just that same steady rhythm, that same quiet presence that felt out of step with everything around it, and Knox let out a short breath through his nose, amused, tilting his head slightly as he tapped his fingers once against the metal edge of the table, the sound sharp, intentional, a small declaration that the moment had begun. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried just enough to pull more attention without needing to raise it. Casual on the surface, edged underneath. "Hey, old man, you lost, or you just picking the wrong place to sit?" And the words hung there for a beat, not heavy, not yet, but enough to ripple outward through the nearest tables, enough to shift a few shoulders, slow a few conversations, while Arthur Brennan placed his fork down with the same deliberate care, aligned it beside his plate as if the world outside his tray didn't exist, and only then, after a silence that lasted just a fraction too long to be comfortable, did he lift his eyes, pale blue and steady, meeting Knox's gaze without a hint of apology, without a trace of uncertainty, and in that instant, something almost imperceptible passed through the air, something Knox couldn't quite name, not fear, not respect, just a weight that hadn't been there before, like the room itself had taken a breath and decided to hold it. Tyler Knox held the old man's gaze for a second longer than necessary, the corner of his mouth lifting into a smirk that did not quite reach his eyes, because confidence had always carried him through rooms like this, through training, through deployments, through every challenge that had tried to test whether he belonged among the best, and so far, nothing had ever proven him wrong, and yet there was something about the stillness in Arthur Brennan's eyes that did not react the way it was supposed to, no irritation, no confusion, no apology, just a quiet, steady presence that felt almost indifferent to the attention, and that, more than anything, pushed Knox to lean in further, because indifference was harder to ignore than defiance, and behind him the two other SEALs shifted slightly, arms crossed, watching with quiet amusement as if this were nothing more than a harmless break in routine, a moment to pass the time, while a few nearby tables slowed their movements, forks hovering mid-air, conversations fading into low murmurs, not because they expected anything dramatic, but because something about the scene felt just off enough to hold their attention, and Knox tapped the edge of the table again, this time slower, deliberate, the metallic sound echoing faintly against the polished floor. "You did not answer me," he said, his tone still light but edged now with the expectation of control, the assumption that this exchange would follow the pattern he understood, that the man in front of him would either explain himself or excuse himself, because that was how these moments usually ended. But Arthur Brennan did neither. Instead, he reached for his napkin, folding it once more with careful precision, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the tray as if the geometry of the placement mattered more than the conversation happening inches away. And it was that small act, that exactness, that caught the attention of someone else across the room. Master Chief Daniel Cross had been halfway through his coffee when his eyes drifted over, not drawn by the voices, but by the movement, by the way the older man's hands moved with a familiarity that did not belong to someone out of place. There was a discipline in it, a kind of ingrained habit that did not fade with age. And Cross felt a faint tightening in his chest, not alarm, not yet, just recognition, trying to surface from somewhere he could not immediately place, while Knox let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head as if amused by the lack of response. "Come on," he said, leaning slightly closer now, his voice lowering just enough to pull the moment inward while still carrying to those nearby. "This is not exactly a public cafeteria, so either you know someone here, or you think you belong here." And a few of the younger operators behind him let out short laughs, the kind that followed confidence rather than humor, reinforcing the shape of the interaction. And still Brennan did not rush, did not react. He simply finished adjusting the edge of his tray, then rested his hands lightly on either side of it, fingers relaxed but steady, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, even, carrying a calm that did not match the tension building around him. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," he said, and the sentence landed without force, without emphasis, but it did not invite argument either, it simply existed, and Knox exhaled through his nose again, this time with a hint of impatience threading into the sound, because the exchange was not unfolding the way he had intended, the rhythm was wrong, the responses too controlled, too measured, and somewhere behind that, Cross set his cup down quietly, his attention now fully on the table in the corner, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the older man's posture, the alignment of his shoulders, the way he held his head, small details that most would miss but that to him felt like pieces of something larger, something that did not fit the surface story. And Knox straightened just a fraction, adjusting his stance, reasserting the space around him as he shifted the tone, still casual, but sharper now. "All right then," he said, the faint smile returning as he glanced briefly at the others before looking back down at Brennan. "Let us keep it simple. What was your rank?" And this time, when the question settled into the air, the room did not just quiet, it listened. The question did not land like a challenge, it settled like a weight, slow and deliberate, pressing into the space between them, and for a moment no one moved, not Knox, not the two operators behind him, not even the men at the nearest tables who had now fully turned their attention toward the corner, because something in the tone had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, and Arthur Brennan did not answer right away. He simply looked at Knox, not up at him, not down, but directly, his pale blue eyes steady and unreadable, and then his gaze drifted, just slightly, past Knox's shoulder, toward the far wall of the mess hall where a row of framed photographs hung in precise alignment, images of past commands, retired leaders, moments frozen in time that most people walked past without noticing, and his hand moved almost absently, brushing against the edge of the table, fingertips grazing the surface as if tracing something only he could feel, and in that small motion something shifted beneath the calm exterior. Not visible in his expression, but present in the stillness, like a memory surfacing without permission, and for just a fraction of a second the mess hall was not a mess hall. The bright overhead lights dimmed in his mind into a low amber glow, the distant hum of conversation replaced by the steady pulse of equipment, the faint vibration beneath his feet not from footsteps but from something deeper, something mechanical and alive, and voices, younger voices, sharper, waiting, always waiting. And he had stood then where he now sat, not physically, but in the same place of decision, where hesitation had a cost and clarity was everything, and the memory did not linger, it never did, it came and went like a breath, leaving behind only that same quiet certainty that had never left him, and when his eyes returned to Knox, the room seemed smaller somehow, tighter, as if the air itself had drawn in, and Knox felt it without understanding it. A brief flicker of something that did not match the script he had written in his head, but pride and momentum carried him forward, his arms folding loosely across his chest now, stance widening just a fraction, grounding himself in the role he knew, the one that had always worked, and behind him one of the SEALs let out a low chuckle, muttering something under his breath about old stories and forgotten ranks, the kind of comment meant to keep the tone light, to keep the moment from tipping into something else. But it did not land the way it was supposed to, it just dissolved into the air, unnoticed. Because across the room Master Chief Daniel Cross had leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table, his eyes locked onto Brennan with a focus that had nothing to do with casual interest. He was watching the details now, the stillness, the restraint, the way the older man carried himself even under scrutiny. And a quiet unease began to settle in his chest, the kind that came when something did not align with expectation, and Knox shifted his weight again, impatience threading into his voice as he repeated, slower this time. Your rank. Each word spaced just enough to emphasize that this was no longer a joke, that an answer was expected, and Brennan exhaled softly, not a sigh, not frustration, just a measured breath, and he straightened just slightly in his chair, not to assert dominance, not to challenge, but simply because it was the natural position his body returned to when the moment required it, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, and carried further than it should have, not because it was loud, but because the room had gone so still that there was nothing left to compete with it. It has been a long time, he said, the words simple, almost reflective, but they did not deflect the question, they framed it, and Knox's jaw tightened just a fraction, the faintest sign that his patience was wearing thin, because this was not how the exchange was supposed to go, not how these situations ever went, and yet here they were, standing in a mess hall that had fallen into an unnatural silence, waiting on the answer of a man who did not seem to feel any urgency to give it, and somewhere deep in that silence, the moment began to shift. Arthur Brennan let the silence stretch just long enough to make the question feel heavier than it was meant to be, his eyes never leaving Tyler Knox, and then, slowly, his right hand shifted across the table, not toward Knox, not in defense, but toward something small resting beside his tray, a simple silver ring worn smooth with age, its surface dulled by decades of use, and his thumb brushed across it once, absent-minded to anyone watching, but precise in a way that suggested it was anything but accidental, and that single motion carried him somewhere else for the briefest flicker of time, not away from the room, but beneath it, beneath the noise and the present, into something older, something earned, the faint echo of voices speaking over one another in controlled urgency, the soft hum of instruments, the steady discipline of men who did not waste words because every word mattered, and at the center of it all, a younger version of the man sitting at that table, standing instead of seated, shoulders squared not out of habit but out of necessity, eyes sharper, faster, carrying the weight of decisions that did not allow hesitation, and there had been a moment, always a moment, where someone had turned toward him, waiting, not questioning whether he knew what to do, only waiting for him to say it. And that memory did not come with sound or detail, it came with certainty, the kind that did not fade with time, and when it passed, it left behind that same quiet presence that now filled the corner of the mess hall, and Knox shifted his stance again, a faint crease forming between his brows as he watched the small gesture, because it did not match the response he expected. There was no defensiveness, no attempt to explain, just that calm, deliberate movement, and behind him the earlier amusement had begun to thin, replaced by a subtle tension that moved through the nearby tables. Like a ripple, not visible, but felt, forks resting against trays, conversations paused mid-sentence, and across the room Master Chief Daniel Cross leaned forward a fraction more, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on the ring, then back to Brennan's posture, then back again, as if aligning two pieces of something he had not yet fully recognized, because there was a familiarity in the way the older man held himself. Something buried deep in memory, not a face, not a name, but a presence, the kind that stayed long after the moment passed, and Knox exhaled slowly, his patience now clearly wearing thin, the casual tones slipping just enough to reveal the expectation underneath. "It is a simple question," he said, his voice firmer now, no longer playing to the room, but directed squarely at Brennan. "You had a rank. Everyone does. What was it?" And the words hung there again, but this time they did not carry the same lightness, they carried weight, pressure, the need for resolution, and Brennan's hand stilled on the ring, his fingers resting there for a brief second before he withdrew it, placing both hands flat on the table, palms down, steady, grounded, and when he finally leaned back slightly in his chair, it was not retreat, it was alignment, the subtle shift of a man settling into the exact position he needed to be in, and his eyes lifted once more to meet Knox's, calm, clear, and unshaken, and when he spoke, his voice was low, even, and carried with it a kind of quiet finality that did not ask for belief, did not demand respect, it simply stated what was. "Vice Admiral," he said, and nothing else, no explanation, no elaboration, just two words that fell into the silence like something solid, something that did not echo because it did not need to, and for a fraction of a second nothing moved, not Knox, not the men behind him, not the ones watching from nearby tables. The room did not react immediately, it stalled, as if the meaning of those words had to travel through layers of assumption before it could land, and Knox let out a short breath that almost formed into a laugh, the reflex of disbelief rising before anything else. But it did not fully come, it caught halfway. Because something in Brennan's expression did not support the idea of a joke, there was no hint of humor, no challenge, no attempt to provoke, just that same steady calm, and across the room Daniel Cross went completely still, the name forming in his mind before he even realized it, a faint echo from somewhere buried deep in memory, and the unease in his chest sharpened into something else entirely, something closer to recognition, as the moment began to tip from uncertainty into something far more serious. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and immovable, and for a moment the entire mess hall seemed to hesitate, as if the air itself needed time to decide what to do with them, and Tyler Knox felt the reflex to dismiss it rise instantly, the familiar instinct to laugh it off, to reduce it to something harmless, something exaggerated. Because that was the only version of reality that made sense inside the framework he understood, but the laugh never fully formed, it stalled somewhere behind. His teeth, caught by something he could not immediately define, something in the way Arthur Brennan had said it, not as a claim, not as a correction, but as a simple statement of fact that did not need support, and Knox shifted slightly, his posture adjusting as if recalibrating, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as he searched the older man's face for any sign of irony, any crack in the composure that would confirm what he wanted to believe, but there was nothing, no tension, no challenge, no performance, just that same quiet stillness, and behind him one of the seals let out a short, uncertain chuckle that faded almost as soon as it began, because the room was no longer reacting the way it should have, the usual rhythm of conversation had not resumed. The background noise had not returned, instead there was a spreading silence, subtle at first, then undeniable, as more heads turned, as more eyes fixed on the corner table, drawn not by volume, but by the absence of it, and across the room Master Chief Daniel Cross felt something settle into place in his mind with a clarity that sent a faint chill through his chest, not because of the rank itself, but because of the name that had followed it in his thoughts, Arthur Brennan. And the recognition did not come from a single memory, it came from fragments, briefings, old mentions, quiet conversations that had never been fully explained, references to a man whose decisions had shaped operations most people never even knew had happened, and Cross pushed back from his table slowly, his chair making a soft scrape against the floor that seemed louder than it should have in the silence, his eyes never leaving Brennan as he stood, and Knox noticed the movement, just out of the corner of his vision, enough to register that something had shifted beyond the immediate exchange, and that awareness added a layer of uncertainty he was not used to carrying, because now this was no longer just a moment between him and an old man, It was becoming something observed, something larger, and he straightened slightly, his voice returning, controlled, but tighter now. "That is a big claim," he said, the words measured, testing, not mocking anymore, but not conceding either, and Brennan did not react to the challenge, did not defend, did not elaborate, he simply reached for his cup, lifting it with steady hands, taking a small, unhurried sip as if the conversation had already concluded, and that was what unsettled Knox more than anything, the lack of urgency, the absence of any need to prove himself, because in every other situation Knox had ever been in, rank was either displayed, verified, or defended. It was something that required acknowledgement, but here it was presented as something that simply existed, independent of whether anyone believed it or not, and Cross began to move across the room, not quickly, not drawing attention, but with a purpose that cut through the stillness, each step deliberate, his gaze locked onto Brennan with growing certainty, and as he approached, the subtle tension in the room tightened further, the kind that did not come from confrontation, but from realization, from the slow understanding that something important was unfolding, and Knox felt it, even if he did not yet understand it, the shift in weight, the change in atmosphere, the quiet pressure building beneath the surface, and for the first time since he had walked over, the moment was no longer fully under his control. Master Chief Daniel Cross did not stop until he was close enough to see the details most people would miss, the fine lines at the corners of Arthur Brennan's eyes, the way his shoulders stayed level even while seated, the exact placement of his hands on the table as if every movement had been practiced over a lifetime and never unlearned, and Cross felt the certainty settle deeper, not loud, not dramatic, but firm. Like something clicking into place after years of being half-remembered, and he came to a halt just off to the side of Tyler Knox, not interrupting, not yet, but present enough that his rank and bearing alone shifted the balance of the moment, and Knox noticed immediately the subtle change in posture, the quiet authority that Cross carried without needing to speak, and for the first time since this started, Knox's focus split, no longer fixed entirely on Brennan, but shared with the man who had just stepped into the space, and Cross did not look at Knox at first, his eyes remained on Brennan, studying him with a level of attention that was no longer casual, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, and carried a weight that did not need volume to be heard. "Sir," he said, and that single word changed everything, not because it was loud, but because of who said it, and how it was said, and a ripple moved through the nearest tables, subtle but unmistakable, the recognition that something had shifted from informal to formal without anyone announcing it, and Knox felt it like a pressure change, his stance tightening slightly, his arms no longer as relaxed as before, because the tone had changed in a way he did not fully control, and Brennan lifted his eyes to Cross, meeting them with the same calm steadiness he had shown from the beginning, and for a brief moment the two men simply looked at each other, not as strangers, but as people measuring something unspoken, something beyond rank or title, and Cross's expression tightened. Just a fraction, not in doubt, but in confirmation. "Arthur Brennan," he said quietly, not a question, but not fully a statement either, testing the name in the air as if it carried its own weight, and Brennan gave the smallest nod, nothing more, just enough to acknowledge without elaboration, and that was enough, more than enough, because Cross exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, but carrying with it the unmistakable shift from uncertainty to certainty, and he straightened just slightly, his posture aligning with a formality that had not been present seconds before, and now he turned his head toward Knox, finally addressing him directly, his gaze sharp, focused, and carrying a seriousness that cut through whatever remained of the earlier tone. "You are going to step back," he said, not raised, not aggressive, but absolute, the kind of instruction that did not invite interpretation, and Knox felt the words land differently than anything else that had been said so far, not as a challenge, but as a directive that came from a place he recognized, even if he did not fully understand why it applied here, and for a fraction of a second his instinct was to push back, to question, to reassert control over the situation he had started, but that instinct met resistance, not from Cross directly, but from the atmosphere itself, from the way the room had gone completely still, from the way every eye seemed to be waiting, not for a confrontation, but for a correction, and Knox shifted his weight, just slightly, the first visible sign that his certainty had been disrupted, and behind him the other seals had gone quiet, their earlier amusement gone, replaced by a watchful stillness that mirrored the rest of the room, and Cross did not move, did not raise his voice, he simply held his position, his presence enough to define the space, and Brennan remained seated, hands resting calmly on the table, observing the exchange without intervening, without needing to, because for the first time since the moment began, the control of it had shifted completely, and everyone in the room could feel it. Tyler Knox did not move right away, and that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed, because in a room like this, hesitation carried meaning. It marked the exact point where confidence met uncertainty, and for Knox, that moment stretched just long enough to feel unfamiliar, his eyes flicking once from Master Chief Cross back to Arthur Brennan, then back again, as if searching for something that would re-establish the footing he had lost, but nothing in either man's expression offered him that. Cross stood steady, composed, his presence quiet but immovable, while Brennan remained seated unchanged, his calm no longer passive but absolute, and Knox exhaled slowly, a controlled breath meant to reset, to pull himself back into a position he understood, and he took a half-step back, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough for the shift to register. Enough for the room to recognize that the line had moved, and behind him the two seals mirrored the change without being told, their earlier posture loosening just slightly, their expressions now more cautious than amused, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was attentive, focused, waiting for what came next, and Cross turned back toward Brennan, his voice lowering further, almost private despite the fact that everyone nearby could still hear it. "Sir, I need to confirm," he said, each word deliberate, respectful, carrying the weight of protocol now that the moment had crossed into something official, and Brennan gave a small nod, not impatient, not dismissive, simply acknowledging the necessity of the step, and Cross reached for the radio clip to his belt, his movements precise, efficient, the kind that came from years of doing things exactly the right way under pressure, and when he keyed the mic, his tone shifted again, no longer conversational, but controlled, formal. The cadence of someone who understood the importance of every word leaving his mouth. "Command, this is Master Chief Cross," he said, his voice steady, cutting cleanly through the silence, and the response came almost immediately, a faint crackle followed by a crisp acknowledgement from the other end, and Cross did not waste time, he did not hedge, he did not soften the statement. "I need verification on a retired flag officer," he continued, his eyes still on Brennan as he spoke, as if anchoring the words to the man himself. "Name is Arthur Brennan." And for a brief moment there was nothing but the low static of the open line, a pause that stretched just long enough to be felt, and then the response came back. But it was different now, the tone on the other end shifting from routine to alert in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, a request for repetition, for confirmation, and Cross repeated the name, slower this time, more deliberate, and the silence that followed was heavier, deeper, as if the weight of that name had traveled through the system and triggered something beyond a simple database check, and Knox felt it without understanding it, the way the air seemed to tighten again. The way even the smallest sounds in the room had disappeared, no trays, no voices, nothing but the faint hum of the radio and the quiet presence of the man sitting at the table, and Cross waited, his posture unchanged, his expression controlled, but there was something behind it now, something that suggested he already knew what the answer would be, and when the reply finally came through, it was not immediate, it was measured, deliberate, and whatever was said on the other end did not need to be loud for its impact to be clear. Because Cross's jaw set just slightly, his shoulders aligning with a precision that spoke louder than any words, and he lowered the radio slowly, his eyes lifting from the device back to Arthur Brennan, and in that moment, the confirmation did not need to be spoken out loud for everyone in that room to understand that everything had just changed. The confirmation did not arrive with noise or urgency, it arrived with weight, the kind that settled into a room without needing explanation, and Master Chief Daniel Cross did not repeat what he had heard over the radio, he did not announce it, he simply shifted, just slightly, but enough for those watching to understand that the question was no longer a question, and when he straightened fully, the posture was unmistakable. Formal, precise, and directed entirely at the man still seated at the table. And in one smooth motion, without hesitation, Cross came to attention, his heels aligned, his shoulders squared, and he rendered a salute that was clean, exact, and absolute, the kind given not out of habit, but out of respect, and the sound of his hand meeting the brim of his cover was soft, but in the silence of the mess hall it carried like a signal, and everything stopped, not gradually, not in pieces, but all at once. Conversations that had begun to stir died instantly, movement froze mid-action, trays hovered above tables, and every eye in the room locked onto the corner where the moment had crystallized, because there was no mistaking what they were seeing, not the gesture itself, but what it meant, and Tyler Knox felt it hit him before he could process it, the realization landing in a way that bypassed thought entirely, his body reacting first, straightening instinctively. His arms dropping from where they had been crossed, his stance tightening as training took over in the absence of certainty, and for the first time since he had approached the table, he did not speak, he did not move forward, he simply stood there, caught between what he had assumed and what was now undeniably in front of him, and Arthur Brennan did not rise, he did not return the salute immediately, he remained seated for a brief second longer, his eyes steady on Cross, acknowledging the gesture with a slight inclination of his head before he placed both hands on the table and pushed himself up. Slowly, not with difficulty, but with deliberation, as if the act itself carried meaning, and when he stood, the difference was immediate, subtle in movement but profound in presence. The same man who had seemed out of place moments ago now filled the space with a quiet authority that did not need to be asserted, and he returned the salute with equal precision, not exaggerated, not performative, but exact. And when his hand dropped back to his side, the room remained still, as if no one was quite sure how to re-enter the moment they had just witnessed, and then, from somewhere near the entrance of the mess hall, came the sharp, unmistakable sound of a door opening with purpose, not rushed, but decisive, and heads turned almost as one, drawn by the shift before they even saw the figure stepping inside, a senior officer moving with measured speed, his presence cutting through the room with a gravity that matched the silence, and the ripple that followed was immediate, chairs pushing back, bodies rising, a wave of attention snapping into place as recognition spread, and Tyler Knox felt it before he saw it, the escalation, the confirmation that whatever this moment was, it had reached beyond him, beyond Cross, beyond the table entirely, and as the officer approached, eyes fixed ahead, posture unwavering, the distance between him and Arthur Brennan seemed to close faster than it should have, not because of speed, but because of inevitability, and when he finally stopped in front of Brennan, there was no hesitation, no pause, just a clean, decisive movement as he came to attention and rendered a salute of his own, sharper, more formal, carrying the full weight of rank and recognition. And in that instant, whatever doubt had remained in the room disappeared completely. The officer held the salute for a fraction longer than regulation required, not out of hesitation, but out of meaning, and when he lowered his hand, his eyes did not leave Arthur Brennan's face. There was no confusion in them, no uncertainty, only recognition, clear and absolute, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the silent mess hall with the kind of authority that did not need to be raised. "Vice Admiral Brennan," he said, each word precise, measured, "I was not informed you would be on base today." And the statement was not a question, it was an acknowledgement, one that confirmed what everyone in the room had just witnessed but had not yet fully processed, and Brennan gave a small nod, the motion calm, almost understated. "It was not planned," he replied, his voice steady, unchanged, as if the shift in the room had not altered anything for him, and the officer's expression softened just slightly, not into familiarity, but into respect that had depth behind it, the kind built over years, not moments, and he took a half-step closer, lowering his voice just enough that it felt personal even as the entire room remained focused on every word. "Sir, it is an honor," he said, and the sincerity in it removed any remaining doubt that this was not ceremony, not performance, but something real, something earned long before anyone in that room had taken their first oath, and behind them the mess hall remained frozen, dozens of men and women standing in place, watching, absorbing, recalibrating their understanding of what had just unfolded, and Tyler Knox stood among them, his posture now rigid, his arms at his sides, every instinct drilled into him now fully engaged, but none of it could undo the realization settling in his chest. Because the moment he had started had moved far beyond him, beyond anything he could control or redirect, and for the first time since he had walked across the room, he felt the full weight of what he had stepped into, not as fear, not even as embarrassment, but as clarity, sharp and undeniable, and his eyes shifted, just briefly, back to Brennan, seeing him now not as an out-of-place old man, but as something entirely different, something that had never needed to prove itself in the first place. And Cross remained at attention nearby, his presence unwavering, his earlier instinct now fully validated, while the officer turned slightly, addressing the room without raising his voice. "At ease," he said, and the command released the tension just enough for movement to return, chairs settling, breath returning, but the silence did not fully break. It lingered, quieter now, but still present, because the weight of the moment had not lifted, and Brennan glanced once more at Knox, not sharply, not judgmentally, just a brief, steady look that carried no accusation, only acknowledgement, and then he reached for his tray, lifting it with the same deliberate calm he had shown from the beginning, as if nothing about the last few minutes required commentary, as if the moment spoke for itself, and as he turned to leave the table, the path in front of him cleared without a word, without instruction, people stepping aside instinctively, not because they were told to, but because they understood. And Knox remained where he stood, watching, the noise of the mess hall slowly returning around him, but something had changed, something that would not reset with the room, because respect, real respect, did not come from being told, it came from moments like this, moments that stayed long after the silence ended, and as Brennan moved toward the exit, unhurried, unnoticed by anyone who did not know what they were looking at, the truth settled quietly into the space he left behind, that some men did not need to remind the world who they were, because the world, eventually, remembered on its own.